This is the last video on consciousness, and we're going to dig into some difficult questions on subjectivity. By subjectivity, I'm not talking about epistemic subjectivity, like some people like chocolates and others don't, but ontological subjectivity, which is the first-person perspective. How is that possible at all? That something can be like something for someone, that they can have a first-person perspective. It seems to be something strange and unique compared to the other physical things in the world. So how is it possible? If you try to distinguish between the subject on the one hand and the subjectivity on the other hand, so the person and the consciousness, then you run into the homunculus problem. If we ask how can this body see and think, etc., and say, well, it's because it has a soul, or because it is the brain that does it, then we wonder, well, how does the brain do it, or how does the soul do it? Well, if you say the soul has a soul, or the brain has a brain area, etc., the problem just continues. You get this infinite regress that doesn't really explain anything. So that's the homunculus problem. And the only way to avoid it is to think that the subject itself is made from fundamentally subjective parts. So we should distinguish them between the sort of full-blown subjectivity that we experience and the basic subjectivity, which we can only say, well, this is a fundamental constituent of the world. It has this capacity that you can combine parts into a whole that can experience that something is like something for someone. But it's we're able to explain the full-blown subjectivity, but we're not able to say anything more about the basic subjectivity except that it is a fundamental constituent of the world. And then, of course, you may be dissatisfied because that doesn't really explain everything, or one could wish to know more about it. But at least we must, if you think it's a poor explanation, try to compare it with other explanations, because either you say it's something non-physical, and I haven't seen anyone then explain how it can arise. The usual explanation is to say, well, it's just brain activity, or it's just that it's so complex, etc. But that doesn't explain either. There's much brain activity which is not conscious. There is much complex activity and complex things that are not conscious. So you need to explain. You need to explain that in addition, and try to avoid the homunculus problem. And I think it can't be done. So this is the best explanation that I know of. That we must say that the full-blown subject, the kind we experience to be, is composed of basically subjective constituents. So what I'm saying is that the qualia field is a field of basic subjectivity where fundamental qualia values can combine into coherent wholes that can have a conscious experience of being a subject of experience. So we put the basic subjectivity parts together into a full-blown subject. We do have some evidence that it seems to be important for there to be a subjective experience at all, that you have this coherent, integrated or unified experience of bits and parts then. You can see, for instance, sometimes there's this figure that looks like either a duck or a rabbit, but you can't see either one or the other, not both at the same time. This is a kind of phenomenon that has been explored much more by a neuroscientist called Nikos Logothetis, where they give completely different input to each eye of animals and humans. And what happens is that even if the physical stimulus is the same at all times, we aren't able to have a conscious experience of completely different things. So what happens then is that you'll have a conscious experience of what comes to the one eye for a while, for a few seconds, and then it will switch over to the other for a few seconds and switch back and forth then. You can even try this yourself. I've done so. Take a couple of toilet rolls in front of your eyes and look at two things that are impossible for the brain to combine, very different things then, and you'll experience first one a few seconds and then something else a few seconds. Switching back and forth, which seems to, or it supports the idea then that you need to have this coherent experience in order for there to be a subjective experience at all. So what I'm saying then is that the feeling of being a subject with experiences is this unified configuration of qualia values being actualized at a place in qualia space or in qualia field without there being something else that has this experience or which this experience is for. So we shouldn't say here's the subject and here's the subjectivity, or here's the person and here's the consciousness. This consciousness is for this subject has this experience. We should just combine them and say that this experience, this stream of consciousness, it is the subject. So just identify the two. Say that the qualia configuration is the subject. This subject will then, since the consciousness of the content of the experiences is caused by a particular body, it gives also the feeling of owning that body or identifying yourself with that body, because the things that you see, for instance, will be to the left or to the right of that body. If something heats up this body, you will feel warm. Stab a knife in the arm and you'll feel that pain connected to that body. So because of this close connection, you also get this feeling of being identified with the body. If one tries to solve the problem of subjectivity by saying that it's composed of parts, then the classical objection is the combination problems. Well, what binds these parts together then? How is it possible that they can unite into one conscious subject? I have already suggested a solution to this by saying that I think that first brains just randomly connected to very different kinds of qualia, but then over time brains would select, not brains would select, but the evolution would select brains that had these more unified experiences. And I explained how qualia could have a causal role, but the point here then is that the causal role of there being this one unified subjective experience identified with this body has the causal effect that I will then care about this body. I will try to get food to this body, or try to make this body have children and care about what happens to it in the future, etc., so that its genes will be spread, etc. So that explains why evolution would select brains giving us this unified conscious experience of being a subject that closely connected to this body. Why does only the subject have access to its own consciousness? That also seems like a good question. If we divide between the two and say, well, here's the subject and here's the consciousness, why does it have access just to its own consciousness and not somebody else's consciousness? But if we identify the two, then the question becomes meaningless, or then we see that having access to your own consciousness is just the same as being that consciousness. So the subject is the stream of consciousness, and that's of course why it has access to it, because having access is just being it. In the future, possibly we can stretch neuron cables between your brain and my brain, and I can have a feeling of what it's like to be you, etc. And then we might need new terminology and terms for what is to have access to others of consciousness, or can I have an experience of having your experience, and am I then just having your experience, or am I having my experience of having your experience, etc. We will need new theories and terminology then, but that's something that can wait. So far I have suggested then the answers that I have to these questions connected to subjectivity. And that finishes then this bunch of videos on consciousness. So we'll now move on to the topic of free will, which is the topic of chapter 8 in the book.